Our next panel is called Up in Your Bits, Intellectual Property, Privacy, and Network Rights. As our policy director, Michael Bracey, mentioned at the start of the day, as the internet is a critical vehicle for artists, labels, and fans to distribute, promote, and discover music, or as Chairman Janikowski puts it, a telecom thunder road. On the policy side, it's been an incredible challenge to balance the question of how do you leave room for innovation and developing business models while also ensuring that artists get paid, and in the case of the next panel, how do you ensure artists are able to retain a certain amount of control over their content? It's no simple task to keep track of where the creative content does end up once it hits the tubes, and we'll be hearing from folks who will likely have an interesting response to Senator Franken's suggestion that network management is code for finding ways to squeeze more cash out of their networks. Joining us for this discussion are Michael Petricone, a Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for Consumer Electronics Association, Hal Ponder, Director of Government Relations for the American Federation of Musicians, Dan Klein, of Media Accounts Director of Dedica Group, and also a partner in apriceformusic.com, which you'll be hearing more about tomorrow. Patrick Ross, Executive Director of the Copyright Alliance and Chairman of the Copyright Alliance Education Foundation, and Harold Feld, the Legal Director of Public Knowledge here in Washington, D.C. Moderating the discussion is Brian Zisk, co-founder of real-time search engine Collecta, the founder of the SanFran MusicTech Summit, and FMC's longtime board member. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all for coming out today. This is a great conference so far, and I hope we can keep it going. So, up your bits, intellectual property protection and network rights. So, we're gonna, well, did Gene just introduce us all? Wait. Well, let's do it again, but take less than 20 seconds each. I helped start the Future Music Coalition. I got the Collecta real-time search engine. I'm doing the SF MusicTech Summit on December 7th in San Francisco. And next.
My name's Harold Feld. I'm legal director with Public Knowledge. I also blog about this stuff both at Public Knowledge and at a blog called Tales of the Sausage Factory, as in people who love sausages and respect the law should not watch either being made, which tries to clear up some of the stuff that happens in Washington, D.C. For folks.
Good afternoon, Dan Klein from Dedica in London. I represent the media division, and this little-known company, there's 2,000 of us, 1,500 in London and 500 down the road in Arlington, Virginia. We basically specialize in data analytics, so we'll talk some more about that.
Hi, Patrick Ross with the Copyright Alliance. We're a collection of all the creative industries, so lots of individual artists and creators. In your space, it would be the music publishers, record labels, and performing rights organizations. But we also have a lot of unions. We need to get Hal in there. But a lot of trade associations, but also book and magazine, newspaper publishing, business and entertainment software, television and motion pictures, all the visual art space, photographers, illustrators, and so forth, and also amateur and professional sports leagues.
Hi, I'm Hal Ponder. I represent the American Federation of Musicians, which is a big supporter of the Copyright Alliance, although we haven't joined yet. But we have over 90,000 members in every state in the country and in every music genre, from Broadway to symphonies to club musicians. We take a lot of stands on important legislative issues such as healthcare, pension, which is important to everyone, increasingly performance rights, net neutrality. We'll talk about some of those today, I hope. If you aren't a member of AFM already, and I hope many of you are, we have material on the desk outside where you can find out more about our union.
Hi, Michael Petricone of the Consumer Electronics Association. Our members make all the things you see when you walk into Circuit City or Best Buy, including many products that enable artists to communicate directly with their fans and make and distribute music quickly and cheaply. We think that's great. And we are also the ones who put on the International Consumer Electronics Show every January in Las Vegas, which is this marvelous technopalooza to which you are all invited.
Technopalooza, love it. Okay, so maybe we'll start with Hal, if that's okay. So basically, I mean, the internet is phenomenal for distributing music, but there are also some problems around it. Care to?
Okay, I mentioned to Senator Franken this morning, AFM is a supporter of net neutrality. We supported the legislation last year in Congress, and we support the legislation that's been reintroduced in the House by Chairman Waxman and Chairman Markey. We don't think it goes far enough, though. We see no conflict in keeping an internet unfettered and free for young, new talent, or talent in general. At the same time, when you do have recordings, you want to protect those. You don't want them to be stolen. So we would like to see a way technologically so that copyright content can be protected without interfering with the free flow of internet commerce. I think that both of those are compatible.
So Patrick, I assume you may agree with that. If you don't, let us know. But what do you think are the appropriate ways to be able to protect the content?
That's an excellent question. First of all, I'd like to say I love the statement that AFM put out on net neutrality. I thought it was very well done. I also liked hearing the FCC chairman today and also Senator Franken. One thing on Senator Janikowski, he called out Alex Shapiro, who's a composer that spoke on an FCC workshop recently on broadband. I was also at that panel, had the pleasure of being down the table from Alex, and she was very articulate on all the great things that broadband has done to allow her to promote herself and her work. She also noted that in terms of her marketing and what she puts online, she does not put her entire compositions online because that would undermine her ability to market herself. Now, she has the right to do that. She chooses not to. It's very important that the FCC chairman has said himself that you need to have a distinction between legal and illegal. He said it at his confirmation hearing. He said it in his speech the other day. He said it here. I liked what Al Franken said. Well, he's a funny guy anyway, but I loved his pay grade line. This is neither above nor below my pay grade. When somebody said, well, how do you do it from a technological standpoint? And, Dan can obviously fill us in a lot on how that could be done. But he said, I don't want to be in a tubes moment, right? I don't want to be, another Alaska senator talking about the internet as a packet of tubes. I think what we're seeing here is our leaders recognizing that you can go after behavior. You can say this behavior is acceptable, this behavior is unacceptable, but you don't want to get into a position where instead of regulating behavior, you're regulating technology. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for technological growth in this area. We don't want to retard innovation. We want to reduce false positives, encourage productive use of technology, and I think that's where we're going.
So Michael, monitoring, filtering, good or bad?
Our concern is making sure that as many people as possible go into the stores, especially now, and buy our devices and make full use of them. With respect to filtering, we are somewhat concerned that allowing ISPs or encouraging ISPs to effectively kind of look into everything you do will discourage rather than encourage use of these devices. The filtering and figuring out what is actually infringing material, what's copyrighted material, is not easy. Our worry is that it may block legal content, it may stunt fair use. If you think about it, how can you tell, if something is infringing just by looking? How can you tell if the owner didn't put it up there on purpose? How can you tell if it's not fair use? How can you tell, show me an algorithm that can detect whether or not something is in fact a parody? We are quite wary of the filtering concept. We also have a concern with the whole notion of government interfering and intervening and imposing mandates on ISPs in order to protect one particular business model. We're not sure that's the role the government should be in.
Your take, Dan?
What's my take on this? I'd probably like to just separate a couple of issues here. We talk about measuring and inspection, and we talk about filtering in the same sentence. And certainly from our perspective, that's really bad news. It is very important to understand what is going on. The action you then choose to do on that understanding is then the thing that is up for debate, and filtering is absolutely in that space. We Dedica, have a view that filtering is probably not the answer. My ask to everybody in the room is, you need to start thinking about understanding the technology that you're using and understanding how you measure what your fans are doing, whether that's legal or illegal. So to come to the point about inspection now, our view is you must measure. Nobody at the moment, anywhere in the world, is measuring what is actually going down the pipe. And the reason is they're terrified of the filtering end of the debate, the net neutrality bit of the debate, where in fact they could be informing the copyright industry and music and film and TV around what is actually happening. And it's once you've understood what is happening, you may then choose to do something other than filtering. You may choose to sell them something that's better. Now, that's a different debate because that's targeted advertising. But you may choose to do something, and that something has to be proportional to what you've measured. But the first thing is measure it and understand it. And then you can understand what you can do in legislative form, what you can protect against in net neutrality, and what other actions businesses need to take.
Harold, monitoring for trends?
Well, all right. My basic touchstone on a lot of these things are how comfortable are you if you move this out of the internet, which is this kind of vague new thing that a lot of people don't feel is settled, and that we got a lot of room to play with. And how comfortable are you with it on your phone? Are you fine with people listening in on your phone conversations so that they can track trends? Are you fine with people listening in on your phone conversations so that they can listen to see if you're ordering pirated movies? Are you fine with them following you around? These are also technologically feasible right now. They weren't when the law developed, which is why we don't allow them. But you could now follow everybody around. We have a lot of privacy concerns with how this is going on. You can follow them around online. You can follow them around in physical space with a lot of Google applications and other applications. You can listen in on their phone calls. We've proven that. And with the abilities we have in computational machinery, you can track for keywords and do all these things. Are we happy with that? Because at basis, that's what we're talking about. It's very easy when we remove this into a kind of antiseptic sounding, well, we want to leverage, we want to service customers, we want to eliminate false positives. But we're actually talking about, at the end of the day, is do you want people spying on you? And if you do, what accountability mechanisms do you want built into the system? Because I've already had my internet service cut off once at a pretty bad time when I was trying to find rehab facilities for my wife who was in the hospital and needed to be transferred from a hospital to a rehab facility. And my internet was cut off, and it took me 2 hours to figure out why. And it was because some bot had decided that I was downloading somebody's IP, which in this case, intellectual property, which I had never heard about. And, the ISP I was using at the time said, well, this is just how we do it. There was no right of appeal. There was no sense that I might be using what has become a utility for something pretty damn important. So I ask all of us, as we're sitting here today talking about this stuff, not to think of this as some kind of business opportunity or some kind of intellectual exercise, but the very real question of, are you happy with it on your phone? And not just for the purposes that you want, but for every purpose. Because once it's on there for one purpose, it's on there for every purpose.
Hal?
Yeah, I just want to respond to what Harold said, because I think to throw out this emotional issue of Big Brother is watching you really takes away from the discussion. The discussion for me is let everyone have a chance to get there, and for me it's always music product, over the internet. At the same time, don't let that music product be stolen. Theft is bad. And I think that I'm not a technological expert, but I think that there can be technological ways of protecting that copyright, whether it's music or video product, without unnecessarily hindering or blocking the internet. The FCC has already established principles to consider network neutrality. One of those is reasonable network management. Of course, you can argue what is reasonable. That same concept is in both the House and Senate legislation from last year. The Senate hasn't introduced their bill yet, but I expect it will be introduced shortly. So I think that reasonable people hopefully can work out a solution where you can keep an open internet and at the same time keep music and video from being stolen.
I would just say that I thank Harold for his statements because I think he actually made my point on regulation versus technology. I don't want anyone listening to my phone conversations, but the good news is long before I was around, people recognize that it's against the law. So what we're talking about here is are there things that can be done in the future that are currently okay under legal law, and do we want to allow experimentation in that space to occur in a way that doesn't disrupt? I can say whatever ISP Harold has, boy, they picked the wrong guy to shut down.
Yes, they did.
I'll say that right now. That was not good if you were in the room. What I would say to that, though, is, but see, he says he didn't have a right to appeal. Well, but that's another thing you need. The Olympics has, testing for steroids and all that. Imagine if you're a sprinter and you go and you're about to run for a gold medal. You've been training your whole life for this. And a false positive comes up. You know you did not test, but for some reason that tested. They have built into the system, they have all kinds of double blinds that would be on the tech side. They have all sorts of appeal sides, and sometimes the law can step in. So that's all built in. So there's been a belief there that, you know what, we'll do this, we'll get it as good as we can. We won't always get it perfect, but we'll then have lots of recourse for that individual afterwards. So if you build that in, if you focus on behavior, not technology, you can get there.
I think, can I just come in here? Because I think from a technology point of view, we do want to focus on behavior. And we do want to talk about sample sizes and anonymous and aggregated. We do not want to go around looking at people, period. It's against the law. So we are very clear about understanding. Nielsen is an incredibly good example in the television space of understanding what content is moving and how people are watching it. There is no equivalent on the internet for people using music. And one of the issues you have is if you can put that sort of Nielsen-like sampling into the way people are using and consuming music, what does that give you as artists, as managers, as the legal representatives of all of the above, in terms of how you then understand your fans and sell to them?
So, Michael, reasonable checks and balances. Odds?
We have I think CEA has a reasonably balanced position on IP issues. First of all, we represent an IP industry. We invent stuff. That's what we do. However, most of our products, when you walk around CES and you look right and left around our 1.5 million square feet of floor space, most of the products you see depend in some way on fair use. And fair use is also critical to what we do. So we look for a balance. I think before we start talking about whether or not it's a good idea to allow your ISP to monitor or look into your communications without your consent or knowledge, I think we really need to step back and say, why are we doing this? What's the rationale here? Frankly, I think if we start doing that proactively, I don't see why people just wouldn't encrypt their data, which is becoming certainly more easy to do. And as was said on the first panel, I think we've moved beyond the old kind of zero-sum, you win, you lose days. And we're starting to put together sustainable business models that will remunerate artists and allow innovation to go forward. I think that's a good thing. I do wish that so much of the time and energy that we're spending on enforcement and filtering and figuring out how to do that was spent actually on figuring out sustainable business models that take advantage of the advantages of digital distribution.
Yeah, okay, and that's exactly why we separate measurement from what you do about it. Because actually measuring it allows you to do that, and it's critical. And the fair use terms and all these. I'm intrigued. Google's sponsoring this. That's just genius. We need to understand what Google is doing with our data. By the way, they're brilliant. So let's not dismiss them. The ask here for everybody, of all the artists here, is do you understand what data they have on the music that you've created? Because actually they're the guys with the value. They've understood that data is giving them the value in this new age. So if you want to make money, go look at the data on how your fans are listening to your music.
I want to say a couple of things. One is I appreciate the nuances of Patrick's position. And I think we would agree in a broad principle about regulate behavior, not the technology and no technology mandates. The question in our mind is, and where does that border end with what kind of experimentation you can have, particularly in a world where, to be honest, there's very little ISP choice. There is significant overlap between the ISP providers and the content industry. That is to say, every single major ISP right now is also a cable provider, and therefore takes a different view of this than than ISPs might have 10 years ago, when the majority of ISPs that were available, and there were a lot more of them available, did not have content. I also need to point out that we have had this debate about what the trade-offs should be with every new technology. We had it with phone, and we came out in a certain place, and that is enshrined in the law. We had it with cable, on whether cable operators should be allowed to monitor what you get for pay-per-view, what you get for your subscription package, and how they can sell and market that information. And that is enshrined in law. And in both of those cases, we came down very heavily on the side of protecting users from having their information listened to. Now, this is important. Don't interrupt me. Of having this information listened to or collected, particularly without their knowledge, but even with their knowledge, we decided that because of the relationship between the network provider and the user and the limited ability of choice, that we had to set some limits. So I say we need to have this conversation here in the ISP space, in the data space. I think that the current state of technology is one that is very perilous because it gives the illusion of being able to do things that we cannot yet do with certainty, and which impose a tremendous cost when we get them wrong. And the problem with experimentation is that at this point in the ISP market, a company's decision to experiment, if that is Comcast or Verizon or AT&T, impacts millions of people. And we can't just pretend that that is a small-scale experiment to determine what the appropriate technological measure should be.
So, I mean, where do we go? I mean, it's very interesting because...
Well, we were talking before we came out on the stage about the devil is in the details.
Yes.
I mean, this is the beauty of what the FCC is doing now. They are setting up a process by which everyone that's a stakeholder or just a citizen can comment on network neutrality, make their views known, and then let's see what they come up with. You know, I don't know if there is a technological solution. I hope so, because I do want to see copyrighted work protected. It's your work. Everyone here is either an artist or an artist representative, I would think. And so I've heard favorable things about digital watermarking or digital fingerprints. I don't know if that's the way to go, but I think everything should be explored at this point, and everyone should keep an open mind and see what is the best way to deal with this.
I would echo that. I would also say that, you know, the last panel we were told to shake it up a little bit more, and then actually they did shake it up. I don't know how much we're going to shake it up. I mean, I liked what Harold just said right now about more competition and more broadband. That panel I was on technically was not a net neutrality panel. This was before Janikowski's speech. It was actually for the National Broadband Plan on how to get more broadband out to Americans in robust and affordable ways, which is something all of us in the creative community want, because like all of you, we all want our works out there and legally available. And it is in the details. I do think you've got some thoughtful people here and in the room and in Washington. I'm actually kind of, I don't know, unlike that Rhapsody guy, I'm actually a little bit of an optimist. And, you know, I think we can get there. But I don't know how much we're going to have bomb throwing on this topic.
Okay, well, let's try the bomb throwing. Yeah. No, not really. But Dan, your take is the least, like, okay, how do I put this? Your take is the most balanced on basically deep packet inspection I've ever heard. But then again, it's also like you're committing to do it anonymously, you're committing to really only track trends, you're not applying any of it to filtering or any of this stuff. How do we protect against all of these practices that are much more offensive, of which what you're doing is the least offensive of them all?
Okay, I'm going to reference here, there's been for those of you that have followed the debate in the UK, there's been a form have got into the UK, and they didn't do it on deep packet inspection. They were doing it on over-the-top tracking of what people were looking at on their websites. And they were doing it based on opt-in. So legally, this is quite
fine.
important.
You opt in,
Legally,
it's your,
this is okay. The public backlash for form in the UK was spectacular. And a lot of that was around the understanding that somebody looking at all the websites and then understanding me. Now, I think that's really interesting in the UK because that set a precedent for what is acceptable in the minds of the public, and that overrides the legal provision. Okay. And so a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what we're looking at in some of the deals that we're involved in the UK between ISPs and labels is around what is publicly acceptable. Because I tell you, we'll be out of business tomorrow if we get it wrong. We know that. It is kind of important for us we get it right. We also believe that having a fairly finessed debate about DPI and deep packet inspection is really important. It is a really tough topic. We don't want to get into trucks and tubes, as the senator did earlier on. We actually want to talk about there are bits of the technology that are incredibly useful, and we should use them. We shouldn't just throw them out on some big anti-DPI bandwagon. You've got to understand that also if we can link some of that understanding to other understanding that you get, say, out of iTunes data. I mean, I'd ask everybody here, please go and look at the iTunes data you can get. It's really valuable. It's anonymous. It's aggregated, but it'll probably tell you quite a lot. If you can understand what's going on, that then really helps. And it helps you understand what business models you can put out there, what potential, if you want to get the lawyers involved and take things down, what you can do around that. You've just got to get out there and understand what's going on.
Well, again, I come from a communications law background. So for me, to a certain extent, these are old debates. We've looked at this in the context of every new medium that has emerged, and we've drawn lines. I would say, looking at DPI as a technology, you have problems that are very similar to what happened in the telephone network, where the telephone network needs to know certain things, if I can anthropomorphize the network for a moment, to work. You have to know the origin of each call. You have to know the destination of each call. You could find out the content of each call, and in fact, by law, we make it so that you can listen in on those because law enforcement, with a proper warrant, can come along and listen in on that. But we set a bunch of rules in order to prevent you from, in order to prevent the phone company from being able to monetize that information, because we thought the privacy was important. So the people who want the kind of information that Dan is talking about had to come up with other ways. They do consumer surveys. They go to the sales sites and ask them to contribute information. They ask people to keep their own diaries and essentially do an opt-in. What I'm concerned about in all of these, particularly with DPI, which, if you talk to folks who have a lot of experience in network management and, not in the bad way of trying to monetize things, but just trying to keep networks running, they'll tell you, well, you don't want to totally eliminate DPI because, we have uses for it. But 95% of what the DPI equipment manufacturers are advertising as the potential uses of DPI have nothing whatsoever to do with those technical uses. They're all about how you monetize this stuff and own your customer and track the information and increase your value and all the things that we have traditionally been very worried about in these contexts. So my fear on a lot of these things, and I guess my somewhat response to Patrick and Hal is to say we can and should settle on the regulatory framework first. That we should have very strong rules that set the limits on, the user privacy and, what you're allowed to do, and not permit, these companies to experiment in ways that, really put people's personalities in the sense of knowing who they are, that thing that upset people so much in the UK, at risk. Without having a legal framework that imposes very, very strong protections on that.
We'd fully support that on the basis it makes our job a hell of a lot easier. I mean, it really is that simple.
I have no problem with that.
I don't either, although I think when you listen to the chairman, I think what he's saying is that part of the regulatory framework is a distinction between illegal and illegal traffic, which I think we're perfectly happy with.
Well, this is where we may get into some of that bomb throwing that you wanted to encourage, because here is the problem or argument. Right now, there isn't a good way, and we were talking about this, backstage before, and I don't want to short circuit Dan's ability to make the case for what he does, but it turns out that particularly when you get to the nuances, not just the downloads from Pirate Cove, or Pirate Bay, or whatever they're calling themselves this week in order to escape the bots. It gets very hard to know what is a permissible transfer, what is a fair use, and how do you prevent what Michael referred to earlier as essentially the arms race of people will respond by encrypting their information or finding other ways to try to circumvent these things. It's not, this is not a black box that we can just make do what we want, or that we want to have operate without knowing what's going on.
Well, yeah, and also, you said this is an old conversation, but in reality, it's kind of more like Groundhog Day. It's a conversation we have over and over. And the notion, I think, at this late date, at this point in our digital history, that we can come up with some kind of magic bullet that's going to stop or reduce unauthorized file share, I think it's absurd. I mean, I'd love it to happen, but I just don't. That horse is just out of the barn and galloping, down toward the Potomac. I think it's done. But I think the good news is that you see lots of stakeholders putting into place viable, successful business models, despite that. U2 sold out FedEx Field last week, and I have a bunch of friends who gleefully went and paid $250 a piece for seats. And the concert business is up double figures this year in this economy. Hollywood had record-breaking box office revenues this summer, and that's terrific. A British study showed that the music industry in Britain is growing. The sales of plastic discs is falling, but the amount of money spent on music is growing. YouTube and Google, as Johanna was talking about in the previous panel, is putting into place all kinds of revenue-sharing deals with artists and studios. Artists like Aaron, who's going to be playing later on tonight at the New Orleans benefit that you should all come to at the Rock and Roll Hotel. And other artists are putting into place innovative business models that rely in part on free distribution to leverage the scarce goods. Despite the file sharing, which is unfortunate but a reality, it's happening and it's working and people are making money. And I think rather than focusing on how best to filter, right, we should focus on how best to promote more of those business models.
Well, we've already started going down the path, so let me take to the next thing. You're already going to talk about what we're talking about. Right. Filtering. Good, bad, should we do it? Can we do it? Let's go.
Let me just say,
no, we shouldn't.
I'd like to say, it's good that people are making money, and it's true there are new business models all the time, but people are losing money every day because your music that's out there on the internet is being taken illegally, and that should be stopped. That shouldn't be allowed. We've got to find some way to deal with that, and I like I say, I don't know how that can be done, but constantly technology is evolving. Let's see what is possible before we close the door.
Can God make a rock too heavy for God to lift?
Well, I mean, let me.
I just wanted to address Michael's comment. I'll let Harold go first if you like.
No, go ahead.
All right. Groundhog Day was perfect for what Michael said, actually. And I just want to note that I heard a couple of things in there, which hard to come back to them. But one of them at the end there, well, first of all, he said people are making money, and so that's fine. But he talked about this experimentation, that technology allows people to experiment and market and put things out there, right? And I think you were giving examples. I mean, that is so true. I'd actually like to, can I bring the audience in for a second on this? All right, first of all, how many of you out there are creators who have a website that promotes your work? Okay. How many of you are creators who had a website promoting your work in 1995? Okay, you know what? We may have actually linked to each other. Because I'm serious, because I actually come from this as a creator myself. I failed as a musician, but I've actually made a living as a writer over the years. In the early 90s, I was a freelance writer. I was writing travel things and celebrity profiles to make money and support my family. but I was working on poetry, I was writing novels, and I was trying to get a syndicated humor column written, okay? Now, Al Franken is where he is and I'm where I am, so you can see how successful I was as a humorist. But what I did was I created this weekly column, I created a website, I posted the columns for free online, I created a mailing list. 1995, okay, I saw a way to get around the big syndicates because I didn't work for a newspaper. I needed to get past the gatekeeper. So I built up a mailing list. I'd send it out a day in advance. I marketed it on Usenet groups. Some of you remember those. And I linked to websites because there were only about 20 of us back then that had websites. So, we all linked to each other. I even took advantage of the Washington Post. The web was so new back then that they had a page in the style section on Thursdays where people wrote in letters saying, go to this website, it's really cool. So I wrote a great review of my website and had a friend post it under his name, and they published it. And I got like 2,000 new subscribers at once. Now, was I monetizing any of this? No, absolutely not. But I took that, and I put together a packet of materials. I put together my best columns. I put together quotes from fans. One woman actually proposed marriage to me, which was very flattering. I was already married, but that was nice. I put all those in there. I put all my web traffic and the number of subscribers I was getting for my free service, and I marketed that to small newspapers around the country that I figured could not afford Art Buchwald and the Washington Post syndicate. And you know what? I actually got some newspapers to sign contracts with me to take my humor column and syndicate it. Now, the syndication model, for those of you who belong to a PRO, you understand how it works. You get a little bit of money here and there. I was in 2 newspapers, okay? I was in a school newspaper in South Dakota and a community newspaper in Ohio. Their first check bounced. But I had worked out a model. If I hadn't decided I then needed to go get a job as a full-time journalist because my daughter was a toddler and my son was on the way, if I'd stuck with this, and maybe if I'd made it, the model always would have been that I still would have had the free and I still would have been providing these add-on services for my fans. And the whole time they were running in these newspapers, they were still online for free. So the readers of those papers could go see my columns in real time online for free. That was part of the contract. I would have continued to provide special columns for my fans that would not have been given to the syndicate. Okay, so this whole notion, you want to talk about Groundhog's Day, this notion of artists recognizing technology as a way to get around gatekeepers and connect with their fans is a very old one. Okay, but that really doesn't have anything to do with the rights holder trying to actually enforce their rights in a digital age. They're separate issues. I'd really like those to be put separate. They get conflated all the time on panels, including at this conference.
Okay. So Patrick, filtering, good or bad?
I think it's all about letting the technologists figure out the right way. Why should I say that filtering works or not? Let's set the rules of what we think is acceptable and let the technologists like Dan who know a lot.
Well, I'm a
I don't know if Dan can write a humor column, but I can't do filtering. So
is there anyone here who thinks filtering will work on not just a technical but a social level?
Well, you have to define what is. I mean, filtering's a very broad term.
It is.
That's part
true.
of the problem.
Dan, filtering, good or bad?
Honestly, complete waste of time.
Filtering
And the reason's very simple, actually. It's all about human behavior. It's got nothing to do with technology. If you go and block somebody, they'll change their behavior. They'll do something else. So the point about encryption that was made earlier on, yeah, it's a really big fear. The day we start filtering or blocking, the technology will change. Those of you, I mean, I'm old enough also, I didn't stick my hand up, I'm old enough to remember 95 as well, because I started life as an engineer in this space. Kind of really interesting, because of course we've had the whole Napster debate. That's rolled away, we've now got Pirate Bay. Well, I give it 12 months and we'll be talking about rapid share. So, the technology is going to roll on, and as people, frankly, as the lawyers in some of the companies with vested interest in maintaining their margin, try and change behavior, all you'll do is change the technology. And, as a technologist, I salute the technologists for changing the technology. You have to. It's innovation. Is it good socially for the industry, for the musicians? Absolutely not. But then we need to rethink how we're changing the behavior models or working with existing behavior models potentially, which is probably the way we need to be.
And that's a great point. I mean, I look at, when BitTorrent was developed. I mean, a phenomenal distribution mechanism. And so many of the copyright aggregators were like, this is horrible. People can distribute works illegally much more efficiently now. And the thing that was missed is that BitTorrent is not anonymous. You know exactly who's distributing those works. So if you know who's infringing, I mean, you know who to go after. It's one of those things where you can't always just say these technologies are bad because they're going to facilitate evil. You've got to say, how can we go after the bad actors? Because there's no one here who hasn't listened to a song that they didn't pay for. I mean, I guess we don't have music between panels, but, you know, there's plenty of music that isn't paid for. There are clearly bad actors who infringe illegally, and in my opinion, those are the folks, if you have to go after someone, you go after them. And I absolutely agree with Dan that when you start filtering, you drive the activity underground, and then all of a sudden, instead of being able to track the bad actors, then you're dealing with a situation that's completely unstoppable.
Well, and in fact, it gets worse because historically what we've seen, and this is, let me start by saying, Public Knowledge has put out a 50-page white paper on why we think filtering is bad. So rather than try to go through all the arguments we made there, I just refer everybody to our website at publicknowledge.org and urge you all to take a look at that paper. And you may not agree with every argument we make, but I do say that for this debate, you ought to think about every argument that we make. But the problem is that there's a culture of user behavior and there's a culture of regulatory behavior and of lobbying behavior. And what has happened is that you do something, you mandate it for the technology, people start encrypting or doing other ways to root around. Then we get people coming here to Washington, D.C. saying, you got to freeze stuff in place because people are getting around this technical solution. So you have to make it illegal to get around the technical solution that we're putting in. That's what happened in 1998 with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. We came up, instead of having this, constant back and forth and experimentation, what Congress was told and what they believed was, well, if you make it illegal to even circumvent these technological, protections that we're going to put in, that will be the end of piracy. Well, does anybody think that piracy was stopped in 1998?
Really? Is Steve Marks here still? Because I just want to know, you didn't recognize that MP3s were a threat before Napster? Then why'd you pass the DMCA? Anyway.
But the last, I do just want to add one more thing here, which, again, it just... we've got the real issue of the question of culture change, the arms race, the things we've talked about and we continue to talk about in this area. And the last thing I want to mention, though, which is the problem, is collateral cost. And because the purpose may not be to promote, to prevent competition and to prevent changes in business models, but when I hear the artists are losing because of piracy, I take a look at what the proof is. And the usual proof is to just kind of extrapolate that every free download was a lost sale, which we all know is rather silly, and to ignore all of the other business that is generated by the same technologies. At a time when sales of CDs in the majors were declining, CDs of independents were rising through online mechanisms. So my question here is, on a lot of these, what's the cost and what's the proof that what people are proposing is actually going to be effective, and how much, and are we going to get what we're going to pay in order to make it happen?
And if I could also just add, Harold's key point is technology does march on, and you can put in place the regime today, which may or may not be relevant next year. I can guarantee that every year at CES there is some bête noire that is going to devastate the content industry. The player piano was described on the last. All right, that was before CES. But you got the Betamax, you got the MP3 player, you got the TiVo when that first came out, you got the Slingbox, which is a marvelous device, which if you don't have, you certainly should. And every one of those it's the threat that's going to upend and destroy the business model. And in almost every case, each one of those things has actually provided opportunities for the content industry and everybody else to expand their markets and make more money. So, again, there's a trend here. And I think the notion that by putting a regime in place, you're going to stop the piracy and stop the downloading and kind of freeze things for the intermediate future is simply, it's just not going to happen.
What regime is being asked to be put in place, Michael?
I think if you impose some kind of filtering regime or filtering requirement, which hopefully none of you are trying to do.
I don't know that we're talking about
Well, we would show you what
Right.
Viacom had wanted at that FCC panel, but then they would sue us for trying to explain what they proposed in a public panel.
So I'm going to come in here because I think one of the debates that we have internally within our business is a debate around proportionality. And this is really important in this space because you've got sort of the construct that we're looking at here is the difference between criminal law and civil law. Really important because we do actually, in the criminal space, very much promote the use of filtering and the use of whitelists and blacklists. We are incredibly active in takedown of child abuse all around the world, and we basically spend our time looking at how you take those sites down, how you identify them, how you blacklist them, how you filter them out, what you do with their content, what you do with the images. That's massively important to us as a business. That's very clearly criminal. The issue we have in music is it's civil, and it's all about how much is it going to cost you to do the takedown versus how much revenue did you lose. Now, for the big labels, that's an easy debate. They've got a lot of profit to worry about, and they can therefore potentially undertake takedown. But I'll tell you, because we have a division that does forensics, so we actually do takedown on behalf of law enforcement agencies around the world. And one of the things we see in the content industry, bluntly, is the only content industry providers that have the money to do the takedown are the Hollywood film studios. And frankly, the music industry, even the big four labels, don't have the money. So I think that the industry has to sort of say, well, let's just move away from takedown, let's move away from blocking, and let's start to harness what's actually really going on and not try and change the behavior, but actually work with it to create money. So to the points being made, in terms of consumer electronics, yeah, just make the money out of it. And the music industry needs to work out how to make that money.
But do you know what our margins are?
We need to help the consumer electronics industry.
Right.
I like the civil criminal thing, and that's interesting because obviously copyright can be both civil and criminal, but normally when we talk about enforcement, it's often civil enforcement that we're talking about. But we've heard that you don't necessarily know if a bit is legal or illegal, but there's no reason you'd necessarily know if a bit is illegal if it's a civil violation or a criminal violation, right? Bits don't label themselves that way.
Well, with child porn, it does.
But I'm getting to that point, right? And here I'm speaking as a father. The toddler I gave up the column for is now 14 and has purple hair. And I let her go to the salon this weekend.
Illegally.
I'm starting to, you got to let kids be kids. I've said this before, DOJ in the same computer crimes division does law enforcement, does the pedophilia, and I want them to do more copyright enforcement, but I certainly don't want it to be done at the expense of that. But if there is some kind of way that you have technological developments occurring in this space, and I'm not a technologist, but if there are one-offs that can also help to fine-tune and improve enforcement, whether it be civil or criminal in the copyright space, I think that's a good thing for everybody.
Yeah, agreed.
Dan mentioned, you were talking about labels and movie studios. I think it's important, getting back, Michael was talking about new business models. I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, there are new business models, and as many of you know, what's changing in the music community is, more and more of you are choosing to retain your copyright, retain your masters, and so it's not all about, protecting the labels or the movie studios through some sort of reasonable network management to keep copyright product from being taken. And, just a slight segue, we've been talking about taking copyrighted work without compensating for it. I just want to mention, as I did this morning with Senator Franken, one of the biggest takers, and it's wrong, is AM/FM radio, who take our music, your music, every day and don't pay a royalty for broadcasting that music. And I hope that you'll support the Performance Rights Act, which is in both the House and the Senate right now. It's being considered in the House. The Performance Rights Act is H.R. 848, in the Senate it's S. 379. And we're up against one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, the National Association of Broadcasters, who were able to get an exemption for themselves when legislation was passed in the 90s that has the new digital music platforms pay royalties, but AM/FM radio got off the hook. So they still get a free ride, and that's just not right. So I hope that you'll support the Performance Rights Act.
Well, we support the Performance Rights Act, I have to say, and we do think that it is ridiculous that royalty rate is based on the technology platform, and would very much like to see a move to everybody pays, and it moves to a rational rate that is not based on how strong a lobbying arm you have in D.C.
So have we had any questions come in over the inner tubes or from the audience? Do we have a mic? Sorry to jump the... Here comes a mic, and since we're webcasting, it's best if you ask into it. Come on up, Shane.
Oh, you pick. Whoever you want.
I was just right. He was the first one I saw raise a hand, so.
Hi. I'm stunned by how much of the rhetoric really echoes the drug wars. And because, a lot of this it comes down to, we have this illegal activity, what are we going to do with it? And then you come back to changing behaviors, and that we want to alter the behaviors of the people. And I don't mean this jokingly, but I talk to my students and I teach and I ask them, so how many of you download illegally? And a lot of them will say, well, yeah, we do, but many more and more will actually tell me that they don't, because they don't want corrupt files, they like good metadata, they like things that actually work, they don't want things ruining their computer. And in many ways, it just seems like a much more valuable take for everyone on this panel is to sort of say, okay, now we have to promote the legitimate uses of peer-to-peer and downloading and that sort of thing in less corrupt file. And I think we're on that path, and I wonder if there are any campaigns you can point to collectively where you say, hey, it's not just you're stealing, but you're actually getting a much better product when you buy this.
That's a really hard one, because there's so many rights involved. So the whole, Peter Jenner, Jim Griffin, all these folks working towards collective licensing really works well. But it's very interesting, because tomorrow we're going to hear from Spotify that has, as far as I'm concerned, hands down the best music service I have ever encountered, even though you can't listen to it in the United States.
I just want to add, and I hope people identify themselves when they ask questions, but I did want to add, absolutely, and we've seen that as you make it easier for people to get content and pay for content, they're very happy to do so. The phenomenal growth of iTunes on one end or Hulu using a different model, demonstrates that the how do we compete with free is by offering a product that doesn't threaten to destroy my computer or steal my credit card information. The more people focus on that, and move towards, advertising the value of trusted sources of information rather than, accusing your customers of piracy, which has been kind of the traditional campaigns. The more successful these pay sites or sites that use other models, I think, are likely to be.
And that's my biggest frustration with the labels, I'll tell you right now, is kind of what Steve Marks was saying, is we need to find a way to replace the revenue we were previously making. And that's not a God-given right in business. And in reality, I think it's very easy using the interweb to make more money for musicians, but it's harder for the intermediaries to make the money.
But that's okay. I do think, and again, I love the record labels and everybody else, but I think the internet allows that gap that used to exist between the fan and the artist to be bridged. And I think once that happens, anybody who's standing in the middle had better have a pretty good justification. I also think, as far as the trade-off you're making between the free stuff and the pay for stuff, and how do you make people pay for stuff, on the macro level, people make that decision all the time, right? You drink Starbucks and not the office coffee. You drink Evian instead of the tap water. You're going to eat tonight at a restaurant instead of a soup kitchen because you're getting some kind of value add. And just like I guess these file sharing services where you get the sketchy files. If you have no money, if you have endless amounts of free time, and if you have a T1 line coming into your dorm room, it probably makes sense for you. If you're somebody like me or most of us, like if I get to read the New York Times that day, like that's lucky. I am more than happy to push a button and pay $1 a song for iTunes.
Okay, so I'm going to get in here because one of the things that we see a lot of is rhetoric around what's happening and how. And one of the reasons that we go on about measuring stuff, we've just done a piece of work where we've looked at how do people illegally look at things, how do they then go, the same people, and use Spotify, and how do they then go onto Amazon and download or buy, quite legitimately, physical copy even. And actually understanding the behaviors and the different groups of people that are doing different things is, and this is to Harold's point actually, it's the proof of what really needs to happen. Now, deep packet inspection is just one of the bits of technology in that, but you know, and I've bleated on about this already today. iTunes data is part of that debate, as is Spotify data. I mean, interestingly with Spotify, I'd be interested tomorrow in this. Last.fm actually have a better API in their back end than Spotify does in terms of the artist and the manager wanting access to their data. So you might want to just ask the question to the Spotify guy, okay, what's the API that gives you the ability to go and look at what's happening to your artist and your fans?
I like to think that things actually are turning around. I think most people do want to pay for the music that they use. And I really took heart this summer when my daughter called me and told me that my 8-year-old grandson, who was going through instruction for First Communion and was being taught about the Ten Commandments, the example they gave of thou shalt not steal was music downloading.
I just say I thought it's helpful to talk about how do we get the legal out there, because I think most people do. I thought that was an interesting question. The young woman on the previous panel who asked about how do you know artists get paid? I mean, these are legitimate questions, and when I meet people, actually, usually when they tell me they no longer file share, it's because they're worried about bots and all that. They're not so much worried about who's getting paid or legality. But we do have to admit this, but as Hal said, increasingly, songwriters and recording artists are holding their own licenses. They're self-labeling. The songwriter that I cited in my FCC testimony has her own label. She and her boyfriend who run the band, they have their own label. They own their own rights. They manage all of this online. So it isn't nowadays just the big guys anymore. And I think I would also add to this, everyone in the room knows, as Brian said, how complicated the licensing and legal space is in music. What you may not know is that you are in, by far, the most dysfunctional and confused and disorganized element of the creative industries. Okay, where I was as a writer and all these other ones, it's actually, there are fewer rights holders, it's more clear-cut, it's easier to get these licensing. If we can solve the problem here in the music space, we're gonna solve it for everybody.
You have something to say, Hal?
No.
Okay, next question.
So I'm Rob Kay from Music Brains, and I have written much computer software over the last 10, 15 years, specifically for music. So I wanted to give a bit of a perspective on deep packet inspection. Well, the old adage on the internet is, well, when we encounter a problem, we'll route around it. And you guys are pretty much acknowledged already that encryption is, a thing that's worrying about the deep packet inspection. Well, if I was writing a P2P system or any kind of system that's designed to basically steal music, guess what I'm going to do? The first thing is going to download an SSL, an open SSH library, and I'm going to encrypt everything, and the deep packet and the inspection is useless. Just remember that, it's completely useless. So deep packet inspection, just throw it off the table and let it go away when hopefully net neutrality comes in.
But Rob, if it's without filtering and it's only inspection, is there as much impetus to route around it? And considering that ISPs have been tracking behavior and, like audio, whatever, Audible Magic have been tracking behavior forever, and P2P networks still haven't migrated to that, do you think that inspection without filtering will actually cause people to do that?
I'm actually really surprised that computer geeks haven't done this out of general principle yet. So I think people will do this before too long. Some need just a little bit of motivation. I think if we have one case of somebody going to jail because of a deep packet inspection, we're going to have a gigantic backlash, and all the P2P people say, screw that, and we're going to encrypt everything. So I'm actually really surprised it hasn't happened yet.
And that's why I have found Dan's approach to be very interesting, because most deep packet inspection is for the purpose of filtering and litigation and all of that. And that will drive people underground. And it's very similar to probably 7 years ago, SDMI got killed on this stage because, you know, there were all these things they wanted to do. They were going to, like, you know, put watermarks in and monitor and da-da-da-da-da. And, you know, and it's like, okay, but if that's voluntary, it's kind of okay. But then what happens when it's legislated? And Leonardo, who was in charge of the SDMI, basically said, well, but why would it be legislated? And we all looked around and said, well, that's because what the legislature will do. And he said, that's kind of strange. I mean, I'm from France. That's not my problem. And it was kind of like everyone looked at each other and said, are we going to let this thing go into place voluntarily, which will then be legally mandated? And I think that's the biggest issue with deep packet inspection is, and we all, I think independently, everyone I spoke to said, oh, well, the devil's in the details. And
yeah,
that's...
I mean, I'll come back on this. The devil's in the action you take. And we were very clear about the actions you don't want to take. There's a good example at the moment. In the forensic space, there's a company called DetectNet who do a superb job of tracking people who are illegally downloading content. Now, I've just made a mistake. They track people who illegally upload content, or who allow illegal upload of content, I should say. And the subtle difference here is that the only way of doing it legally without getting yourself into an entrapment debate, which will have you as a criminal offence fairly quickly, is to look at who's exposed their catalogue on the internet. So you're not actually finding anybody who's downloading. You're finding people who've exposed their catalogue accidentally, potentially. So the question is, you're right in the sense that there's been a lot of noise made about deep packet inspection. Understanding the problem to then have a much more informed debate about behaviour is, I think, what we're suggesting. We are not suggesting that you want to go and shut them down. I mean, you're right also, thankfully, that people haven't moved into the encrypted space, and that's probably because they haven't yet been nudged to move into the encrypted space. There's a great book on nudge, it's called Nudge, out there, and it talks about how you change people's behaviour. Go and look at it, because it's really important in this.
What was it called, Nudge?
It's called Nudge.
Nudge by Cass Sunstein.
Yeah.
I do have to say there is one place where we're starting to see this, and it's because of a regulatory nudge, which is Canada. Canadian equivalent of the FCC, the CRTC, permits, as of last year, the two major wholesalers of internet transport service. They're Bell Canada and Rogers Cable, which are the two big ones, and they are required to sell to rivals. But starting last year, they allowed them to start doing traffic management on the argument that peer-to-peer was taking up too much file sharing space. So the response was that within a week, BitTorrent.com had released a new version which encrypted its traffic in a way which made conventional tools for detecting the file sharing obsolete. And a lot of people who had been upset when the FCC told Comcast they couldn't do this, and happy when the CRTC let Bell Canada do it, were outraged when BitTorrent.com responded. You know, from where I sit, this was naturally what was going to happen, and it's one of the reasons to stop trying to force these solutions through regulatory means in the first place.
Can I just also add, there's some good news in this as well. Encryption is not necessarily the end of it for everybody. I mean, everybody paints encryption as being the thing that's going to stop everybody dead. Unfortunately, for those of you who like encrypted stuff, in order to set up encryption, you need to work in the clear. And that's really important, because if you're looking for somebody who's doing encrypted traffic, you can still find them. So it's just a whole lot harder. Let's just leave it at that.
I'm from France, actually, and I care a lot about all the things. And the three-strike law just passed like a couple of weeks ago. So I wanted to know what you think about this kind of solution, which give like ISPs the legal power to cut down the internet to users.
Okay. Into the back, Shane. Three strikes, you're out. What do you think? What about a foul ball?
No, I find it. I find the concept troubling. Just because of this, I think we heard a wonderful, persuasive statement from FCC Chairman Janikowski a couple hours ago on how access to the internet is critical today if you're going to be a functional and productive part of society. 40% of companies are advertising their jobs only on the internet and so on. So to set up some system that cuts off your internet, especially, I'm not sure how the French one works, without judicial review, that cuts off your access to this essential thing, because you downloaded a Celine Dion song or what have you, just seems to me to be somewhat disproportionate.
I'm going to say, go back to what I started with, which is how comfortable would we be with this in the phone system? If you did 3 things wrong that might involve phone calls, you lost your right to have phone service. And, I would just put it out there that part of the problem is we need to stop thinking of the internet as, some sort of criminal tool or tool that people can do without, a luxury item that people can do without, and instead recognize that increasingly this is a utility, and we should no more, cut it off because somebody used it for a bad purpose than we would their electricity or their phone service.
Yep. Plus, I don't buy it. I mean, you'd be fined $150,000 per song, but you're going to worry about your internet being cut off when you can go to the store and get another internet connection? And
what about everybody else in the house? I mean, your kid downloads 3 different songs, and the entire household now can't subscribe to broadband.
And I provide wireless ISP to my neighborhood. Or whatever. Sorry, you go on and
I was
bring
just
the
going
mic
to
up
say
here.
this gets back to what I brought up earlier, how does it sit with the FCC principle of reasonable network management? Is it reasonable or not? That should always be the test.
Well, I think the test in Europe is the European Human Rights Act. So kind of the European response to this is you're almost certainly going to breach human rights by disconnecting the internet. From our perspective, if what it has is a counterproductive change in behavior, it's a complete waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, I've shut off my ground line, and this iPhone in California only works half the time. So, I mean, all I've got to make phone calls is the internet.
Ron Suarez, Loudfeed. I'm going to tell you a very, very short story, and it's going to sound like it's about me, but I don't think I'm alone.
It's a friend, so it's okay.
In what I'm doing. Loudfeed builds technology for content owners to manage and sell their own content. Dick Huey from Toolshed, who's here, I host his content, and he works for Merge and many other labels. So I get a DMCA takedown notice, even though I'm representing the content holders. And in June, I've had business insurance for 25 years. I've been in the software industry. In June, my insurance company saw that I wrote the software for TuneCore and doing business with Dick Huey, so they canceled my insurance policy because I'm too high of a liability working in this industry. And they canceled my workman's comp. So I had to fire all my employees and make them contractors. And now I don't know how I'm going to get health insurance. I'm going to work it out. I'm not asking for sympathy for me, but all these problems you guys are having, it ripples through the whole economy.
And that's a huge problem. And I know, basically, whether work is illegal or legal cannot be detected. Well, okay, change that. In some cases, you can detect it, but in many cases, you cannot detect the difference between a legal file transfer and an illegal file transfer based on the technical contents of that file. Anyone disagree? Okay, good, because you can't. So that's a big problem, and and anytime you're going to try to mandate, or put in technical means, the biggest frustration, it's funny, is say you end up filtering, and then all of a sudden a musician who has the rights won't be able to send a file to their web developer or to somebody who wants to use it commercially. I mean, yes, you can encrypt it, you could run around it, but there is no way to really technically determine the difference.
I find it hard to believe we'd find ourselves in a space where that was actually a problem, where a rights holder couldn't transfer their own work. I also think we need to be aware of this perfect is the enemy of the good thing. You say you can't always tell the difference between legal and illegal. I don't think there's anybody who would dispute you on that. But would you agree that there are times where it's pretty darn obvious that a certain particular transfer is illegal? Would you accept that?
No, I think you can. I think you can determine it, and the key one here is context. When you look at a file, you don't look at on the internet. You don't look at a file standalone. You look at it within the context of how that file is being moved. And frankly, honestly, if it's a torrent off Pirate Bay, it's almost certainly illegal.
Yeah, but the point of this last story was it didn't have anything to do with file sharing. It had to do with what the collateral damage is, or the regulatory cost, or however you want to say it, in an area nobody would think that the filtering argument and copyright liability would cost 9 people their health insurance, and it just did. And that's the problem here, is that when you put this stuff out there, and you're looking at this through a very narrow lens, and you're thinking this doesn't cause problems, and we can do this through technological solutions, what you're losing track of is all of the bodies out there who are getting killed while people are experimenting and trying to figure this out.
File sharing causes death. Okay, we got the stop sign. Thank you very much. Let's have a big hand for the panel.